What if the very drive that fuels your ambition is also what's silently fueling your chronic illness? Today's guest, Kelly Greene, has lived it and now helps high achievers heal it. On today's episode of The Pauline Chilton Show, we're joined by Kelly Greene, Harvard-educated wellness coach, licensed attorney, and mental health professional who brings a powerful and personal perspective to healing. After 15 years in the legal world, Kelly's own journey through chronic illness and burnout led her to uncover a deeper truth. For many high performers, early life trauma doesn't just affect the mind, it impacts the body in profound ways. Now, through her groundbreaking 5H framework, Kelly helps ambitious professionals and wellness seekers move beyond surface level symptom management and toward real root level healing, blending neuroscience, psychology, and holistic wellness. If you've ever felt like your success is coming at the cost of your health, or you're ready to break free from burnout and build a life that's both high performing and deeply fulfilling, this conversation is for you. Hi, Kelly. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Pauline. I don't know if I have anything left to say because you've said it all. That's fantastic.
Oh, good. Thank you. In our earlier conversation, we spoke about your 15 years as a title attorney. What was the turning point that made you realize it was time to walk away from that career?
Sure. Well, just to clarify, I was an attorney, or I still am, for over 15 years, but I practiced title specifically for about 5 of those. So just as an FYI, I wasn't doing title the entire time. But when I decided to walk away from law predominantly, I owned a title agency and a boutique law firm. So I was really busy and doing really well. Like, it was kind of the height of my success, to be really honest. I was making the most money that I'd ever made and had recurring clients that always came back to me and are still sad today that I'm not doing their title work and real estate deals. But I was never going into law, was not this just dream of mine as a child. It wasn't like, oh man, when I grow up, I'm going to be an attorney. My dream will be fulfilled. For me, I had a lot of creative pursuits early on, but then it was like, you can, for lack of a better analogy or metaphor, my grandfather used to have the saying, you can wish in one hand and you know what in another and see which one fills up the fastest. I don't know if anyone's ever heard of that, but my grandfather used to say that to me. And I guess I just listened to it a little too much. And I realized, my creative endeavors are probably not going to pay off. I should go to law school and do something with my brain because I'm a smart girl and, I could do this. And I did. And law school was easy. And I got a law degree and I found practicing law pretty easy. But in 2020, I just had some family upheaval that I experienced that just laid me on the ground. I know we're going to talk about resilience, and that's what I teach. And I was not resilient. To the world, to everyone around me, I looked amazingly resilient. No one would have said, oh, she's not resilient. Everyone, including therapists, were like, you're so resilient. But I wasn't. And so in 2020, I say that the easiest part of my 2020 was getting COVID 2 days after my hysterectomy. That was the easiest part of my 2020. It was just a rough year personally. And I hit the ground. And when I hit the ground, I dove in and started doing work on myself and decided I've got to change something. And I knew the one thing that I didn't love was practicing law. I just didn't love it. I loved my clients. I loved talking to my clients. I liked helping them with their journeys, and then they would leave and I would have to do all the work, all the contracts. And so that's where I started with my own transformation, was quitting practicing law, selling my practice, and going back to school. So that's the kind of the meat of how it came to be. But
Wow. And there was like this worldwide upheaval that went on in 2020. So as a collective, we
We
all
did.
shared in the experience in one way, shape, or form.
Mm-hmm.
So you've made a powerful connection between early life trauma and chronic illness.
Mm-hmm.
Can you take us back to when you first started noticing that link in your
Sure.
life?
It was 2020 when I first noticed that link. Now, to go back for a bit, I have suffered with autoimmune conditions since I was the first that I remember coming on or having a flare up was when I was 12. And I was out of school for the better part of my seventh grade year. I spent much of that in a wheelchair. During that year, I had no diagnosis. No one, this was in the 80s. So no one knew what autoimmune was not just a popular diagnosis at that time. So it was like, what's going on? And she's 12. And then so I just started battling autoimmune. Every few years, I would have another sort of flare up until I was in 2020 when life went to hell in a handbasket, honestly. And I had another flare up. By that point, let me say though, by 2020, I had been diagnosed with scleroderma, lupus, fibromyalgia, mixed connective tissue disorder, and Addison's disease, which is
Wow.
your adrenal glands being blown. So I'd had 5 autoimmune diagnoses by 2020. And I had never made the connection on, did anything that happened in my life, did that play a role in having all of these autoimmune conditions? In 2020, when I went through personal upheaval, I got sick again. And it was the first time that I went, wait a minute, is this level of stress? Did this bring on this condition? Like, did this cause this flare up? And I still don't know that I had even at that moment went, and is this rooted in my early childhood? Because in my early childhood, I endured a fair amount of what psychologists or therapists would consider big T traumas. So I just had I endured a lot of traumatic events in my early childhood. In my mind, that had not affected me. I did not have anxiety or depression or PTSD. I was top of my class over and over again. I found it easy to make good grades. I liked to work hard. I liked to be successful. And so obviously what had happened to me in early childhood was not affecting me. So in 2020, when life went crazy, it's when you know, it's kind of like sparkles started going off and you're like, wait a minute. Like when the Matrix, I don't know if you've seen the Matrix, but
Yeah.
that moment in the Matrix when Neo, when he realizes he's the one, and then all of a sudden he can see the Matrix and he can dodge bullets and that. It was just like that. And it was like, oh, wow. I think that this is tied to my stress level. And I think that my autoimmune, wonder if that has anything to do with my childhood. So when I started at Harvard, I went there as a fact-finding mission for myself. I did not go to Harvard because I thought when I leave here, I'm going to be a coach or I'm going to be a therapist or I'm going to be a psychologist. I went to figure out what was going on with me. And I realized that there is a load of research that connects early life trauma, and it doesn't have to be at 1 or 2 or 3, anytime before 18, really anytime before 25, because our brains are still in such plasticity until about 25, right? There's these critical periods like 0 to 7, you're going to have the most, and then 7 to 14, 14 to 21, 25. So, when we experience traumatic events during those periods, those critical periods, they can affect us in myriad ways. They can affect us psychologically through anxiety, depression, PTSD, and loads of research supports this. They can affect us also physiologically in chronic illness, and they don't have to happen at the same time. So a lot of people think, oh, you've got anxiety, depression, PTSD, and from that is born these chronic illnesses. That's not true. You cannot have the psychological adverse effects of trauma, but you can have the physiological adverse effects of traumatic events. When I first went to Harvard, that's what I dove into and started, understanding, and light bulbs going off nonstop. So, yeah.
That experience of pursuing your degree at Harvard, how did your research on resilience shape the way you now define healing?
Yeah. So before going to Harvard, or even in the beginning of Harvard, there were a couple of books that I know we're going to get to, but it's kind of like that helped push me in that direction. And so I was not thinking about resilience per se when I went to Harvard. I was just going, why is this happening? And as I started doing the work, then when you're looking at traumatic events from a research perspective, they're going to talk about resilience. I mean, it's just kind of a given. You're going to see talk about anxiety, depression, PTSD. And if you don't have that, you're considered resilient. And that's what I found out, is that in the research on traumatic events and on resilience, it is all focused, almost all. There is a new growing body that's coming up, but almost all of it is focused on psychological resilience. So if you endure these traumatic events and then you have anxiety, depression, or PTSD, you are considered not resilient. No mention at your physiology. If you endure traumatic events and you do not have anxiety, PTSD, depression, you're considered resilient. No mention of your physiology. So I looked like a pillar of resilience, right? I had endured really awful trauma early on, and I didn't have anxiety, I didn't have depression, and I didn't have PTSD. And I didn't have those hidden. There's some therapists I've talked to, or they're like, well, maybe that you did have it, but you didn't recognize it. I really didn't. I didn't. But I had all of these physical issues. And so I started going, there's got to be more to this story. There's got to be more to this story. And sure enough, the research supported that. So there's like bodies of research in especially in any field, but in psychology specifically. And they just like this body of research kind of lives together. And you're going to see my cat, by the way. Let me just go ahead and let you know.
Oh, it's all good. We have
Luna.
a cat too.
And she's 21. And so because she's 21, she gets to do whatever she wants to do. So if you see her pop up, there she is. She probably just wants to get in my lap. So in the resilience research, you see really nothing about biology besides, you would see in a lot of research papers whether or not your biology contributes to whether you are psychologically resilient, right? Like, does your inflammatory markers make you more or less depressed? But they're not looking at that as an outcome, right? They're just looking at it as a predictor of whether or not you would be psychologically resilient. Then there's another body of research called psychoneuroimmunology and health psychology that really have looked at, they're not looking at resilience, but they were looking at are there physiological effects of trauma, of traumatic events? And it's like, yes, resoundingly, yes, right? And these bodies don't talk between themselves very often. And so there is some new emerging research where they're starting to talk a little bit. And there's a phenomenon called skin deep resilience that I had read about that really just struck me. And that's kind of what led me into my own research. And skin deep resilience is a phenomenon by where what we're talking about, folks that have gone through early life traumatic experiences or adversity, and they have no presentation of anxiety, depression, PTSD, and they are ladder climbers. They are achievers. They are the ones they're the overcomers. They're not just the survivors, they're the thrivers, right? And they are just killing it in life. And you look at their biomarkers versus someone who isn't as driven as they are, and you'll see much more increased levels of metabolic syndrome. So, which is going to be higher waist circumference, blood pressure. Why am I going blank on all of my metabolic syndrome markers. Oh, goodness. Cholesterol. Thank you. As I'm thinking, I was like, I'm never going to pull it out. Saw higher occurrences of autoimmune chronic illness, higher occurrences of cardiovascular disease. And so it's a significant difference, right?
Right.
So, well, you didn't see this, though, in folks that had not endured early life trauma, but were driven and going. You didn't see such an increase from a chronic perspective. You saw more acute issues, like acute occurrences where stress had affected them. But as far as like those chronic illnesses, you didn't see as much. So it's really kind of like this perfect storm of early life adversity and then being that overcomer that is that recipe for physiological vulnerability.
Wow. Wow. So you talk about holistic resilience. And so for our listeners, can you walk us through what holistic resilience means and how it goes beyond the traditional definitions of what we often hear?
Mm-hmm. So resilience is one of those words that is used by almost everyone, and it has a different meaning to almost everyone. In the research psychology world, when you say the word resilience, they're like I was talking about, they're just talking about psychological resilience. It is, I went through something hard and I don't have PTSD, depression, anxiety, right? So when you look at it in a holistic way, when I define resilience, I defined it holistically, which is why I call it holistic resilience, to help people to know that I'm not just talking about psychological. So I define resilience as the absence of the negative effects of traumatic experiences or adversity, both physiologically and psychologically. So that's holistic resilience, right? Because you're looking at the whole package. A lot of people think for some reason, when they think of the word holistic, I get a lot of, that means organic or woo-woo. And I'm like, no, it means whole. It's just like whole without the W, holistic resilience, whole self resilience. When you're holistically resilient, it just means that when you go through something traumatic, that your mind, body, soul, spirit bounces back, and you don't have lasting effects, negative effects from that, going through that traumatic event. So I describe it as like a bouncy ball, and I need to get a bouncy ball. And I've got a little video on my social media so I can show people. If you have a bouncy ball and you're watching it in slow motion, that ball literally hits and it morphs. It like flattens out and comes back together and bounces up. But when you're watching it with the naked eye, it looks perfect, right?
Right.
So what happened? That ball is like amazingly resilient. That ball is a perfect analogy of resilience, because what it did is that ball hit that surface, that traumatic event, right? It absorbed the energy of that impact, let the energy move through it, and actually use that energy to form it back into its whole self. And it went on its happy way, right? Versus an egg that hits and splats and it doesn't reform, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or a yo-yo that it might look like it hits, but if you're looking at it in slow motion, that yo-yo will, hover right above and just keep going. It never absorbed the energy. So it never had that traumatic event actually impact it. So holistic resilience is just looking at resilience through the lens of your whole self.
Those are some really great analogies. I love that.
Oh, good. I like my analogies, and I will say this about resilience in general. This is what I tend to hear that people think resilience is. They tend to confuse resilience with grit. And grit is a wonderful concept. It's a wonderful thing to strive for. Grit is the ability, like, let's say, and a lot of high achievers are really gritty, okay? Grit is like, okay, here I've got this goal set out in front of me. And, let's say, since we've talked about real estate, let's say you're a real estate agent and you want to be in the $1 million club, right? Or $10 million club, or whatever the club is, platinum. And so there's this big lofty goal, and it is set out for a year in advance. It's set out in front of you. And Some days you just don't want to get out there and you don't want to prospect, or you don't want to do the things that you've got to do to meet that goal. But instead of giving in to I just don't want to do it, you do it anyway, right? These are the things that I've got to do to get to that goal. And I'm going to keep my eye on the goal and I'm going to do it. I set a goal. That's grit. That has nothing to do with resilience. So for that reason, a lot of people will say, gosh, you can just be too resilient. If you're too resilient, that's unhealthy. And I'm like, that doesn't even make sense, because that means that you don't know what resilience is, because all resilience is holistic resilience is holistic health, just being healthy. So if I hear someone say that I'm just being too resilient or you're being too resilient, that's like hearing you're being too healthy. There's no such thing, doesn't everybody want to not absorb the energy of the hit and then bounce back and not be have the floor pulled out from underneath them?
Right.
Yeah. But they confuse it with grit. And grit, in a sense, you can morph grit into something that's unhealthy, by saying, let's say that you are wanting to run a marathon and you've got to train for 6 months and every day you've got to run, X number of miles. And, you wake up on some day and you've got the flu. Well, and you're like, well, I said I was going to run this every day, so I'm going to get up and do it. I'm going to get up and push through. That's like toxic grit, right?
Right.
That has nothing to do with resilience. That's being ridiculous, really. Let's just be honest. So that's what I do here. I hear a lot of people confuse resilience with a toxic form of grit. And so I do like to clear that up. I'm like, resilience is wonderful. You should want it and work to cultivate it. So because we all hit hard times and we all should want to bounce up, and we all have the ability to. There's not one person on the planet that does not have the ability to cultivate more resilience.
Yeah, exactly. So let's talk about your 5 pillars.
Okay.
Healthy head, heart, hands, human connection, and holy connection. How did this framework come to life?
Yeah.
And how do you see it transforming the way people heal?
So it came to life when I was doing my research. So as part of my master's program, I actually stayed at Harvard a year longer and did empirical research. So I worked with an amazing lab that is part of Harvard Medical School and the VA. And I studied specifically holistic resilience. So resilience that's both psychological and physiological in a veteran population. And it was important to me to use veterans because I was able to, in my study, have folks that have, and I looked at that from an early life perspective too, early life, because everyone that I looked at had either been deployed or had adult trauma. So, which I think my study was, I think I had 706 people in my study and 690 something had been deployed, right? So they had experienced adult trauma. So that was important because then I was able to parse out those who additionally experienced early life trauma to know, hey, everyone in the study had adult trauma. Now we can look at the levels of people who also had early life trauma to see if there's a difference there, right?
Right.
So in doing my study, the first part of any study is a literature review. So you have to basically make a case, which my law degree came in handy in my years of, being an attorney, and I litigated for a long time, really came in handy. And because I had to make a case for doing this study. And in doing that, I consumed thousands of other studies of, research and papers on resilience. And there just were themes that kept coming up in folks that were able to bounce back and folks that weren't. And that's how I came up with the 5 H's, because there were these reoccurring themes over and over. And then I saw it in my own study when I looked at my 706 participants, and they were, like you said, a healthy head, which is the ability to regulate your cognitions or your thoughts. So the ability to have healthy thoughts and the ability when you don't have a healthy thought to be able to reframe or move through it, right? Healthy heart, the ability to regulate your emotions. So the ability to generate more healthy emotions. And then when something comes in that's really difficult, the ability again to regulate that or reframe it to move through it. Healthy hands. So the hands represent the body and behaviors. So resilient people who were holistically resilient, they had healthier habits when it came to nutrition. Physical activity was a huge one. I mean, a big one. Like the more active people were, the easier they were to bounce back from trauma. And then behaviors, just like what they did, how their habits played out in their lives. So that was the hands part. Healthy human connection. So social support is a big part. Social support and mentorship is a really big part of developing resilience. And it's important to delineate that it's not just any support, right? So what I noticed in my study and all the other studies I consumed was that it wasn't just the fact that if I'm in trouble, I have someone I can call. It's that if I'm in trouble, I have someone who I can call who is healthy, right? It's also having people who are on a growth path. So if you're on a growth path, having people in your life that's on a growth path. It doesn't mean that you have to cut everyone out who is not on a growth path. It doesn't mean that you can't have unhealthy people in your life. It just means that you've got to have a connection with some healthy people. And mentorship was important. That was another factor that was really important. So that went under the human connection. And the last, but the most important, and one that's honestly the foundation, in my opinion, and the research supports this, is holy connection. And under holy connection, that can be meaning and purpose, awe, the ability to find awe. So it is connecting to something outside of yourself. So if that is, and there was no preference to how that worked out, right? So if it was through spiritual, like a general spiritualism, like a Native American sort of practice, meditation, what a Christian prayer practice, through Buddhist prayer practice, through Judaism prayer practice. So all sorts of different ways to connect with the holy. The point though, where we saw folks become more resilient is that they had a connection with something outside of themselves and other humans. So in that pillar, I really focus a lot on meaning and purpose and a lot on awe and practices to help you develop those.
That's amazing. And you said you've consumed thousands of studies, and what you just described sounds very similar to the blue zones.
Oh, yeah.
Those have been studied. How do these centenarians get to live so long and live such full, fulfilling, happy, healthy lives? And it's so fascinating.
Mm-hmm. It is. I've not done, and that is on my list because I've read about the blue zones. I watched the Live to 100, that documentary.
Oh, I don't remember the name of the documentary, but I know exactly what you're talking about.
I watched the whole documentary. I was fascinated by the blue zones. And what I don't know about those folks, are their early life histories or their histories in general as far as traumatic experiences. So I'm curious about that. And that's on a list of like all of my dream studies or my dream things I want to write about or learn about. Literally knowing the traumatic events of folks in the blue zones and how they, handled that is on my short list.
Awesome. You mentioned the books like When the Body Says No and Cured. How have those books influenced your work and your message to high achievers?
So in 2020, when I had my, I'm trying to think of a way to put it that's doesn't use curse words, rough year. We'll just leave it there. And somehow I was given the book When the Body Says No, or someone had mentioned it, or I have no idea how I got a copy, of this book. I know I bought it or I'd heard something from Gabor Mate, who is the author of that book. Anyway, I read that book And basically that book is, he talks about Gabor Mate is a physician, and he talks about how unconscious stress creates or contributes to serious chronic illness. And I mean, that's the whole point of when the body says no. Basically, his theory is that you've got unconscious stress and it's toxic, and your body getting sick is a way of it trying to say, stop, right? No, stop, stop, stop. It's a compelling book. And I read that, and it changed that book changed my life in the sense that I had never considered that what I was experiencing in my body had to do with the fact that early in life, I had undergone trauma. And then that trauma, what I did with that trauma was, instead of in my mind caving to it, I became a thriver, right? But I became a thriver at the expense of my body, but never putting those dots together. So then I read the book Cured. And again, I have no idea how, I heard about this book. I think I was watching a documentary with Gabor Mate, and he had mentioned it. I think that's how it happened. And it's by Dr. Jeffrey Rediger, who is a psychiatrist, and he's actually a Harvard psychiatrist. He works and was an assistant professor at Harvard. And he studied terminal illness. So terminal or uncurable illness like stage 4 melanoma, multiple sclerosis, ALS, right? Things that you were just not going to be cured from. You couldn't just say, oh, you're a high responder, that sort of thing. And because there are people every day that are quote unquote cured. And he was like fascinated by like, nobody gets cured from these. How are these people getting cured? And I am not giving anything away by telling you this in the book, because the stories are fantastic. So go out and buy these books, and they're awesome. But basically he looks at different avenues in which these folks said I was cured. So he spends 2 weeks at a healing center in like the jungles, like in South America. He looks into different diets, keto, veganism. He studies, miracle healing from a Christian place somewhere in the States. He looks at people that said it was yoga that healed me. People that said, no, it was eating carnivore diet. It was people that had this particular type of massage. Like he looks at all of these things. And he basically said, here's the deal. I can't say that any of those cured them, because it didn't cure everyone, right? Some people were cured, but majority weren't, right? He was like, but he found these ties that bound every single case of spontaneous remission together. And that was that every person that was cured, when they were faced with this is it, right, death, they decided, I'm going to quit living an inauthentic life. I'm going to start living an authentic life. I'm going to change my identity. If I'm going to die, I'm just going to be who I've always wanted to be, instead of being who others, or even I think I have to be, right? It was the difference in, it's not just living your desires, it's giving up expectations of both yourself and others. And those were the people that were cured. So that's what I was fascinated by. And at Harvard, that's again why a big reason that I went there and wanted to study this. And that's what I worked through in my coaching with folks, is that, through this program and through these 5 H's, at the core of it is an identity change. That's really what we're doing at the end of the day, is we're looking at these different, areas of your identity, and we're becoming the you were born to be instead of the you were made into.
Yeah. And isn't it amazing how, have you read the stories of when people had near-death experiences?
Oh, yeah.
And then they came, when they were healed or came back to life from, the seconds that they were dead or near dead or whatever, they said, you know what? I'm just going to live my life the way I want to live it.
Yeah. I mean, I cannot remember the author of who wrote the book. Was it The Last Words of the Dying or The Last Wish? I can't remember. She was a hospice nurse, but basically, and and her book lines up with research. I'll always go back to research. I love evidence. I love research. I'm a big old nerd. But there are so many studies that actually corroborate what her observations were, is that the biggest regrets folks have at the end of their life, or even in later years, it doesn't even have to be the very end, is not doing the things they wanted to do. They don't regret the things they did that didn't pan out. It's not like, gosh, I wish I hadn't have started that, or I wish I hadn't have tried that. No, it's, I wish I had tried that. They don't regret their failures. They regret the things they never did, right? Or the things that they just, and my theory, and I don't have research to back this up, I think the reason why that these 5 H's rose to the front of resilience is that when you're able to regulate your thoughts and your emotions, and when you move your body, and when you surround yourself with healthy people, and when you have a connection to the divine, the expectations of the world and the weird expectations that you put on yourself melt away. And then you can be exactly who you want to be. And then you don't let those opportunities go by without diving in, right?
Right.
You don't say, no, I'm going to wait and do this after I'm successful. Or no, I'm going to not do that because that's going to hurt someone's feelings. Or, on and on and on. You just, you know the desire of your heart, and you live it, and then you're resilient, and you're healthy, and you're cured,
Yeah, that's awesome. So what do you say to the high performing person who's experiencing burnout or illness, but hasn't yet made the connection to unresolved trauma? Where can they start?
Mm-hmm. They can start with both of those books that we mentioned. They can start, I've got resources on my website, but I think that when you are, I'm looking at it through my own lens of when I was so driven to be all the things not to every person, right? There's a lot of people out there. It's like, I want to be all the things to everybody, right? And I was like, that's crazy. I just want to be all the things to the people that matter. And you couldn't have told me different, right? And so it's like, I would drag myself around in like excruciating pain because I had to do it for those people that matter, right? And I would say, I'm not being all the things to everybody. I'm just being all the things to these 10 people, right? And what I would say to you is that that's going to kill you. That people die every day because they're not holistically resilient. And you can be fragile like an egg that we were talking about earlier, right? Which most high achievers are not. They're not eggs. So they're like, I hit that thing, and I'm the same, right? Or you can be fragile like a bridge. And that's where most high achievers live. A too rigid bridge. Because when a bridge is too rigid and it is not built with flexibility, it will eventually crumble under the weight of the cars that are on it. And when that bridge crumbles, everybody crumbles with it. So what I would say to them is, don't be a too rigid bridge. Start digging deep and going, wait a minute. I've got my cholesterol's out of control. My, X is out of control. Maybe it's whatever. Or I've got these chronic arthritis or anything autoimmune or reoccurring cancers. I mean, there's just so many things that can actually have its root in unresolved trauma that's just living in the body. Body will pay the price. There's a book out, The Body Keeps the Score, and I get it. But I think it's more than that. I think that the body will just pay the price. I had one lady say to me when I was working with her, she's like, so you're saying that nobody gets a free ticket out? And I'm like, yeah, nobody gets a free ticket, but you can buy one. And that's called developing resilience, right? Sure, nobody's getting the free one, but you can do the work, right? And so you can be a awesome bridge. You don't have to not be a bridge. You just have to have some flexibility. in that bridge. And so that's what I would say to high achievers is that you don't have to sacrifice performance. If you love it, if that's what you love, like truly, like there are some people I work with and they love it, right? I didn't love it like they loved it. They love it. I'm like, great. Be a high achiever, be a big performer. Fantastic. Just do it resiliently because we want you around forever, as long as you possibly can be. And you don't want to be the candle in the wind, right? That burned out long before you should have, So those 2 books are great places to start. My website has resources on there, but that's where I would tell them to start.
And go ahead and share your website. I'll put it in the show notes.
Sure.
Please go ahead and share that for the listeners.
Sure. It's called holisticresilience.com. So I'm trying to make it easy. And that's just holistic, HOLISTIC, resilience.com. That's it. I've got information on there. I'm developing more information. I'm in the middle of writing a book that should be out by the end of the year, hopefully. But yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kelly. And I'll go ahead and close us out.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you.
If today's conversation with Kelly Greene resonated with you, I encourage you to visit holisticresilience.com to learn more. Whether you're interested in one-on-one coaching, corporate wellness programs, or booking Kelly for a keynote that truly transforms the room, this is your opportunity to bring holistic resilience into your life or organization. And if you found value in this episode, please take a moment to subscribe to the Pauline Chilton Show on YouTube or listen on Apple, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform. We're here to inspire meaningful conversations that support your personal and professional growth. Want to support the show? Click the links for Adobe and Descript in the show notes. Those are the exact tools we use to bring each episode to life. Until next time, keep investing in your healing, keep showing up, and keep building the life you were meant to live.